2 dozen rifles aimed steady in the dusty barn, their barrels cold and unyielding. The dim afternoon light spilled in through the cracks, casting long, sharp shadows that stretched across the hay-strewn floor. Outside, the wind carried the scent of sage and dry earth, the kind of smell that clings to your skin after days beneath a relentless sun. Chantre. Comanche warriors don't just show up at your barn by accident, Bear murmured, voice low and steady despite the tremor beneath. They come for blood, for justice, or for war. His fingers tightened on the worn wooden stock of his rifle. The barn's heavy door creaked under the weight of approaching boots, dust swirling in the shafts of fading light. He could hear faint voices beyond. Words spoken in a language both foreign and familiar carried on a breath of tension that wrapped around him like a noose. But let's go back to where it all started. The ranch lay nestled against the jagged spine of the high desert hills, where the scrub brush fought the cracked soil for every drop of water. A lonely place, as harsh as it was beautiful, with skies wide enough to swallow a man whole. Bear had lived here for years, a solitary figure carved out of the same stone and sand. The land was his only family now. No wife, no kin, just the stubborn animals he raised and the ghosts of promises long broken. He was a man shaped by silence, his face weathered by sun and sorrow, dark eyes that held the memory of too many lost nights. His hands were rough, the kind worn by years of hard labor and harsher decisions. The day had begun like any other. The faint glow of dawn spilled over the hills, painting the land in pale gold. Bear was out by the corral, mending a fence torn by the last storm. His horse, Dust, waited patiently nearby, tail flicking away flies in the morning heat. It was then he spotted her. A figure hunched by the edge of tea, her brush half hidden beneath the torn remnants of a faded shawl. Her skin was sunburnt and cracked, eyes hollow but fierce. She moved with a fragile grace, like a sparrow caught in a sudden gust. Bear's gut twisted. There was something in her gaze, a quiet desperation, a story aching to be told. He didn't say a word at first, just watched as she crawled toward the barn, limping, the dirt smearing her once fine dress. When she looked up, their eyes met, hers filled with silent pleading. "Please," she whispered, voice trembling, "don't talk about my face." Bear's breath caught. The wound on her cheek was raw, jagged, a scar half-healed, half-hidden beneath the shadow of her hair. It spoke of violence, of secrets she carried close to her skin. He hesitated. In these parts, strangers meant trouble. Stories spread fast, and kindness could be a death sentence. But something deeper stirred within him, a pull he couldn't deny. He reached out a calloused hand. "Come inside," he said quietly. Inside the barn, the world grew still. The scent of hay and leather mixed with the faint metallic tinge of blood. Bear fetched a rag, dampened it from the water trough, and gently cleaned the wound. She flinched, eyes closing against the sting, but didn't pull away. "What happened to you?" Bear asked, though he already knew the answer. The West was cruel, but cruelty here was something spoken in whispers. She shook her head. "Not here. Not yet." Outside, the horizon darkened with storm clouds, the distant rumble like a warning growl. The wind shifted, carrying with it a faint murmur, the sound of horses riding hard, voices calling in a language Bear recognized from old stories. He glanced toward the door, then back at her. "Who are you running from?" he asked. She swallowed, eyes darting to the cracked window, then back to his steady gaze. "The past," she said softly. "And the men I want to make sure I never forget." Bear's jaw clenched. The land had a way of swallowing secrets whole, but sometimes those secrets found their way back, like ghosts hunting the living. As she rested against the rough wooden wall, Bear saw the weight she carried, not just on her skin, but in her silence. She was a stranger, tangled in a story older than the prairie, a story written in blood and broken promises. He thought of the warnings he'd heard in town, how the settlers feared the native tribes, how suspicion and anger carved deep divides, how mercy was often mistaken for weakness. But as the first drops of rain began to fall, Bear made a choice. The barn door creaked again, this time heavier, the sound of footsteps nearing. His hand rested on the rifle, ready, but his heart beat with a different rhythm, one of quiet defiance. Outside, the wind whispered through the tall grass. Somewhere beyond the hills, the past was riding in, shadowed and relentless. But inside that barn, a flicker of something fragile and new took hold. "Please," she said again, voice barely a breath, "don't talk about my face." Bear gave a slow, soft smile, not one of mockery, but one that held understanding, pain, and the faintest hint of hope. The storm rolled closer, and with it, the beginning of a reckoning. Bear's fingers lingered on the worn wood of his rifle, the weight of his choice settling heavier than any bullet. He hadn't meant to invite trouble, but trouble, it seemed, had a way of finding you, especially when you offered kindness where none was expected. The girl, her name was Lilu, though Bear only learned that later, rested silently in the corner of the barn, eyes closed against the dull ache in her face. The wound was healing, but the pain beneath ran deeper. Bear sat beside her, offering a rough piece of bread he had saved for his own dinner. She accepted it with trembling hands, the faintest flicker of gratitude, attitude in her tired eyes. He heard the voices from town before he saw them. "Bear's harboring an enemy." The voice was sharp, clipped with suspicion. It belonged to Jed McCready, the rancher's rival, a man whose bitterness was as old as the parched earth. "They say she's one of 'em," another voice added, older, worn by years of distrust. "That girl's a Comanche. Ain't no good in that." Bear didn't respond. His jaw tightened, but he knew better than to provoke the restless grudges of the townfolk. They'd lived too long with fear and old wounds to suddenly welcome a stranger, especially one with scars that spoke of battles no one wanted to revisit. He glanced back toward the barn door, where the sun had dipped below the horizon, turning the sky to bruised purple. Word spread fast. In a place where every man's business was everyone's concern, the whispers grew into rumors by nightfall. The sheriff came by, his hat pulled low, eyes scanning the shadows. "Bear," he said, voice low, "you're playing with fire. That girl, she could bring trouble right to your doorstep." Bear's response was steady, quiet but firm. "She's hurt, and she needs help." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "This ain't the way of things. You help her, and you put us all at risk." Risk. The word hung in the air like a thundercloud, ready to burst. By morning, the town was divided. Some saw Bear's choice as an act of mercy, a reminder that the land belonged to more than just grudges and old battles. They whispered of forgiveness, of a future where kindness might heal more than scars. Others saw it as a betrayal. Townsfolk muttered about loyalty, about lines not to be crossed. Mothers pulled their children closer. Men eyed Bear with cold suspicion. In the saloon, conversation stopped when his name was mentioned, replaced by sharp glances and hushed curses. Bear kept to his land, tending his animals, but the Wabiyutuus. 8 of judgment settled like dust on his shoulders. The barn became a refuge for Lilu, but also a tinderbox of unease. One afternoon, as Bear worked the fence line, the mayor, a thin man with a hawkish face, approached, his boots stirring up dry dirt. "Bear," he said, voice dry as the wind, "the town's restless. They're talking about sending a posse. You need to send her away before it comes to that." Bear looked him in the eye, steady and unflinching. She's not going anywhere. The mare's mouth tightened. You're making a dangerous enemy. Bear's gaze flicked toward the barn. Inside, Lilu stirred, fragile but alive. I'm not the one to fear. Days passed with tension thick enough to cut. Then came the boy, Tommy, a lanky teenager with more courage than sense. He'd grown up idolizing Bear, learning to ride and shoot under his quiet tutelage. But even Tommy was caught between admiration and the town's boiling anger. One evening, Tommy sat beside Bear by the fire, shadows dancing in the flickering light. Why'd you help her? He asked, voice barely above a whisper. She's not like us. Bear stared into the flames, searching for the right words. Because sometimes, kid, the right thing ain't the easy thing. But folks say she's trouble, Tommy pressed. Bear's eyes met the boy's, steady and soft. Sometimes trouble's just pain wearing a different face. Outside, the night deepened, and the restless whispers grew louder. Townsfolk gathered in small groups, their faces grim with decisions born from fear. At the heart of the storm was Mrs. Harlan, a widow whose husband had fallen in the last skirmish with the native tribes. She spoke at the general store, voice sharp and unyielding. If we let this stand, she said, we're asking for more bloodshed. Bear's risking all of us. Her words ignited nods and murmurs. The line between mercy and danger blurred, and the town stood at a crossroads. Bear knew what was coming. One afternoon, as he patched a broken fence near the corral, Lilu approached. Him, eyes steady but shadowed with worry. They're talking about a posse, she said softly. You'll be the first they come for. Bear nodded, the weight of the inevitable settling in his chest. We'll face it, he said quietly. Together. Her lips parted, as if to say more, but she stopped. Instead, she reached out, brushing dirt from his sleeve, a simple gesture, heavy with unspoken trust. That night, Bear sat on the porch, the cold wind cutting through his jacket. The town was quiet, but the storm within it raged on. He thought about the warnings he'd heard in town, the distrust, the fear, the old wounds reopened by his choice. Then he looked into those desperate eyes again, the ones that had pleaded, "Please don't talk about my face." And he made the decision that would change everything. The first sound came just before dusk, the soft but unmistakable thrum of hooves on the hard-packed dirt road winding toward Bear's ranch. The air, heavy with the scent of sagebrush and rain-soaked earth, seemed to hold its breath. Bear stood at the edge of the porch, eyes scanning the horizon where dust clouds rose like ghosts. His hand rested lightly on the rifle slung across his back, a gesture more of habit than intent. Dust shifted uneasily beneath him, sensing the change in the air. In the distance, shadows moved, figures on horseback, deliberate and slow, their numbers growing as the light faded. Bear's jaw tightened. He knew what was coming. "The Comanche," he muttered, voice low. Inside the barn, Lilu watched from a cracked window, her hands clenched in her lap. The wound on her face itched with the weight of the moment, a reminder of a past that refused to stay buried. She glanced toward Bear, his silhouette framed by the dying sun, a quiet strength amidst the mounting storm. Out on the road, the riders slowed, their leader raising a hand. The war drums had not yet sounded. But the air carried a silent warning. The Comanche had come, not as raiders but as judges. Bear's neighbor, Jed McCready, appeared beside him, spitting tobacco into the dust. "You invited them here," Jed said, voice harsh. "Now you got to answer for it." Bear met Jed's gaze evenly. "I'm ready." The group approached the gate in near silence, except for the soft clinking of gear and the creak of leather. The leader, a tall man with weathered features and eyes like cold steel, dismounted with a fluid grace. His presence commanded the space, and the others followed suit, faces hidden beneath broad hats and feathered adornments. Bear stepped forward, the tension between them a palpable thing, stretching the quiet like a taut wire. "We don't want war," Bear said, voice steady, "but I won't turn her away." The leader's eyes flicked toward the barn, then back to Bear. He spoke in slow, deliberate English, words weighted with meaning. "She carries our pain. We seek only truth." Lilu emerged, stepping from the shadows with a cautious calm. Her voice, when she spoke, was soft but carried the weight of history. "I am no enemy," she said. "I am a child of this land, as much as any." Murmurs rippled through the riders, a mix of skepticism and quiet respect. Bear felt the fragile thread holding this moment taut, aware that one wrong word could unravel it all. The leader nodded once, then spoke to the group in his native tongue. The riders shifted, some dropping their weapons, others watching with wary eyes. Bear glanced at Jed, whose jaw was clenched in reluctant acknowledgement. The neighbors were watching from a distance now, some armed, others just curious. The line between peace and violence wavered on a knife's edge. The leader approached Bear again, extending a hand, an offering of truce. "We come for answers," he said, "for justice, for healing." Bear took the hand, firm and unyielding. "Then let us find it together." As night deepened, the riders set camp near the Ran. Fires flickering like stars against the vast darkness. Around them, the land held its breath, the distant call of a coyote echoing through the hills. Inside the barn, Bear and Lilu sat in silence. The tension had not lifted, only shifted. The past was no longer distant. It was here, pressing close, demanding reckoning. Bear looked at her, voice rough with emotion. "You carry a burden I can't fully understand." Lilu's eyes glistened in the firelight. "And you carry one too." Outside, the flickering flames cast long shadows, ghosts of a land torn between old wounds and new hope. The night wore on, thick with stories left unspoken and futures uncertain. Bear knew that by dawn, the quiet standoff would give way to choices neither side could avoid. As the first pale light brushed the horizon, the leader spoke again, voice low and steady. "We must decide what kind of peace we want to live with." Bear nodded. The moment had come. The firelight flickered softly inside the barn, shadows dancing on rough-hewn beams as Bear sat beside Lilu. The air hung heavy with unspoken words, thick with the kind of silence that felt louder than any gunshot. Outside, the campfires of the Comanche riders smoldered quietly, their warmth a faint echo against the chill that clung to the night. Lilu reached into the folds of her shawl and pulled out a small, worn object, a faded tintype photograph, edges curled and darkened with age. She laid it carefully on Bear's knee. The image was of a man and woman, their faces stern yet kind, etched into the fragile metal, like a memory, begging to be held. "She was my mother," Lilu said softly, voice breaking with the weight of grief. "Before the soldiers took her away." Bear looked down, the photo trembling in his calloused hands. The face staring back at him was a reminder of a life stolen, of families shattered by violence neither side could fully explain. "I've carried this with me," she continued, "because no one else would remember." Bear's throat tightened. He understood then that this girl, this wounded stranger, was more than a survivor. She was a living testament to the pain buried beneath the land's surface. Outside, a sudden shout shattered the fragile calm. One of the riders had spotted movement near the far edge of the camp. Bear rose, stepping toward the door, the weight of his rifle familiar and steady. A young scout approached, eyes wide with urgency. "Men from town," the scout said, voice tense. They've come with guns drawn. They say Bear's betrayal can't stand. Bear's heart sank, but his expression remained calm. The line between friend and enemy blurred once more. He returned to Lilu, kneeling beside her. They don't understand, he said quietly. They only see fear. She looked up at him, eyes shimmering with unshed tears. Then we must show them something different, she whispered. The tension spilled over as a group of townsfolk rode into the camp, their faces hard with accusation. Mrs. Harlan led them, brandishing a rifle, her voice sharp with anger. "Bear, you've brought danger here," she shouted. "Turn her over, or we take her ourselves." Bear stepped forward, standing between the town and the riders. His voice was calm but unwavering. "She's under my protection." Murmurs spread through the crowd, some backing away, others snarling with distrust. Tommy, the boy who looked up to Bear, stayed close at his side, eyes wide but resolute. The leader of the Comanche riders raised a hand, signaling for silence. Then he spoke, voice carrying the weight of generations. "She is not your enemy. Judging kindness as weakness only breeds more pain." A heavy silence fell, broken only by the crackling of the campfires. The faces in the crowd flickered between doubt and reluctant understanding. Lilu stood, voice clear, ear and steady despite the tension. "Judging me by my scars is like judging this land by its drought. Both hide a deeper story." Her words lingered in the night, soft as a prayer, but fierce as a storm. Mrs. Harlan's grip tightened on her rifle, but something in Lilu's gaze stopped her hand. The anger didn't vanish, but it faltered, replaced by a grudging respect. Bear saw it too, a moment where hatred might give way to something fragile and new. Tommy stepped forward, voice steady. "Maybe it's time we stop fearing what we don't understand." The crowd shifted, the storm inside them beginning to settle. As the firelight waned and dawn crept closer, Bear and Lilu exchanged a look, one of quiet resolve, of shared pain, and of a hope that maybe, just maybe, kindness could break through the walls built by fear. The first light of dawn stretched across the high desert, painting the sky in soft shades of rose and gold. The campfires had dwindled to glowing embers, the night's tension melting into a fragile calm. Bear stood at the edge of his porch, watching the horizon where the Comanche riders prepared to leave. Lilu sat quietly beside him, her face still marked by the scars she'd begged Bear not to speak of. Yet now, beneath the gentle morning sun, those marks seemed less like wounds and more like stories etched into her skin, stories of survival, resilience, and quiet courage. The town had come to a restless understanding. Mrs. Harlan, once fierce and unyielding, had softened her stance, though the hard lines of loss still lingered in her eyes. The posse that had threatened violence had dissolved, replaced by a cautious peace born from shared pain. Bear knew this was only the beginning, a fragile truce held together by the promise of something more than revenge. The leader of the Comanche riders approached, his eyes steady and grave. He handed Bear a small bundle wrapped in cloth, a gift, a token of respect. Inside was a worn leather pouch filled with dried sage and a carved wooden feather. "For protection," the leader said simply, "and for the road ahead." Bear nodded, accepting the gesture with gratitude. It was more than a gift, it was an acknowledgement of trust. Lilu rose, brushing dust from her shawl. She looked toward Bear, her eyes clear and determined. "I will not run any more," she said softly. "This land is mine, as much as anyone's." Bear smiled, a quiet, weary smile that held years of hardship and hope. "As long as you're here, this place has a chance." The riders mounted their horses, their silhouettes framed against the rising sun. They rode off slowly, the sound of hooves fading into the vast silence of the plains. Bear turned back toward his ranch, the weight of what had passed settling gently in his chest. The scars on Lilu's face, once a source of shame and fear, now spoke of a deeper truth, that kindness could be a quiet revolution, and forgiveness a bridge between worlds. Years later, children would hear the story of the drifter and the girl who begged, "Please don't talk about my face." They'd hear how a man's simple act of mercy sparked a change, how courage lived in the spaces between fear and hate. And they'd learn that sometimes the most powerful battles were fought not with rifles, but with the kindness to see beyond the surface. Bear and Lilu stood side by side, two souls bound by a land both cruel and beautiful, their futures forever entwined in the fading light of the Old West.